The scream came from the north ridge, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet forest like a blade through silk. Elena Marsh froze mid-step, her boots sinking into wet mud, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had been running for almost an hour, ever since the car had spun off the icy road and rolled twice before slamming into a tree. She did not know these woods. She did not know where the nearest town was. All she knew was that something was following her, and it was not human. Branches snapped behind her. She spun around, breath fogging in the cold air, and saw nothing but shadows and pine trunks stretching into darkness. Her phone had shattered in the crash. Her jacket was torn at the sleeve. Blood had dried along a shallow cut on her forehead, and every part of her body ached from the impact. She had no idea that she had crossed an invisible line only minutes earlier, a border that marked the edge of Frostmoor territory, land that belonged to a pack of wolves ruled by a king who was said to have no mercy left in him. A low growl rumbled from somewhere close, and Elena's instincts screamed at her to run. She obeyed. Her legs carried her forward through thick brush, past fallen logs slick with rain, deeper into a forest that seemed to close in around her with every step. She did not see the figure moving parallel to her through the trees, matching her pace with terrifying ease, a shape too large and too fast to be any animal she had ever heard of. When she finally broke through a clearing, she stumbled and fell hard onto her knees. Gasping, she looked up and saw them. 4 men in dark clothing stood in a loose circle around her, their eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made her stomach twist. They did not look surprised to see her. They looked like they had been waiting. "She's the one who crossed the line," one of them said, his voice flat and cold. "Human," another muttered, as though the word itself was an accusation. Elena tried to speak, tried to explain that she had crashed her car, that she was lost, that she meant no harm to anyone. But before she could get a single word out, the tallest of the men stepped forward and yanked her up by the arm, his grip like iron around her wrist. "The Alpha will decide what happens to you," he said. "Trespassers on Frostmoor land don't get second chances." She was marched through the forest for what felt like miles, her mind racing with questions she was too terrified to ask out loud. Alpha, Frostmoor. The words meant nothing to her, and yet the way the men spoke them carried a weight that made her blood run cold. When the trees finally parted, she found herself staring at a massive stone building rising out of the earth, like something from another century, its windows glowing with amber light, its towers disappearing into a canopy of fog. Guards flanked the entrance, watching her with the same guarded suspicion as the men who had brought her. She was pushed through a set of heavy wooden doors into a hall so large it swallowed the sound of her own footsteps. Torches lined the stone walls, though electric lights hung from the ceiling as well, an odd blend of old and new that told her nothing about where she truly was. At the far end of the hall stood a man who did not need to be introduced. Everything about him commanded attention, from the way he stood with his arms folded, to the stillness in his expression, a stillness that felt more dangerous than any shout. His dark hair was pushed back from a face carved with sharp, unforgiving lines, and his eyes, a pale shade of gray, fixed on her the moment she entered the room. This was Cale Ashgrove, Alpha King of Frostmoor, and every person in that hall lowered their gaze the instant he turned his attention toward the woman who had been dragged before him. "Explain," Cale said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be obeyed. The guard who had brought her forward stepped forward and spoke quickly, explaining how she had been found stumbling through the eastern woods, alone, injured, and clearly human. Cale listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. She felt like she was being studied, the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided whether to eat or ignore. "I didn't mean to trespass," Elena finally managed to say, her voice shaking despite her best effort to sound calm. "My car crashed. I was trying to find help. I didn't even know this land belonged to anyone." A murmur rippled through the guards standing along the walls. Speaking without being addressed directly was clearly not something people did in this hall, and Elena realized her mistake the moment Cale's gaze sharpened. "You crossed onto Packland during a storm," Cale said slowly, "and you expect me to believe that was an accident." "It's the truth," Elena said, lifting her chin despite the fear coursing through her. "I don't even know what a pack is. I don't know what any of this means. I just want to go home. Cale took a step closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with him. Elena had never in her life felt so aware of another person's presence, as though the air itself bent slightly around him. She did not know that beneath his controlled exterior, something ancient and violent was stirring, a force the pack called the Beast, a part of Cale that had never once shown restraint toward an outsider. The guards around the hall tensed, sensing the same shift Elena could not name. They had seen what happened when the Beast rose to judge a stranger. They braced themselves for the worst, ready to see this trembling, injured woman meet the same fate as every uninvited guest before her. But nothing happened. Cale stopped less than 3 feet from her, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides. His breathing, usually so measured, hitched for the first time in longer than he could remember. Something inside him that had roared with fury at every stranger who dared step onto Frostmoor soil was suddenly, inexplicably silent. Not subdued, not restrained, silent, in a way that felt like peace. He did not understand it, and the confusion flickered across his face for only a moment, before he masked it again. "Take her to the healer," Cale said abruptly, turning away before anyone could question the strange stillness that had passed over him. "She stays under guard until I decide what to do with her." The order was met with stunned silence. No one in that hall had ever heard the Alpha King show mercy to a trespasser, let alone a human one. Whispers spread through the guards like wildfire, as 2 of them stepped forward to escort Elena out of the hall, her legs weak with relief and confusion in equal measure. She did not understand what had just happened. She did not understand why the man who looked at her like she was a threat to be eliminated had suddenly changed his mind. All she knew was that she was alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. As she was led down a long corridor lined with old paintings and flickering lanterns, Elena stole a glance over her shoulder. Cale still stood in the same spot, staring after her, his hand pressed against his chest, as though something inside him had shifted, and he could not yet explain what. The healer's quarters were warm, compared to the cold stone halls, filled with the scent of dried herbs, and something faintly medicinal. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind but wary eyes examined the cut on Elena's forehead, cleaning it gently, while muttering under her breath about humans and their fragile skin. "You're lucky," the woman said finally, wrapping a bandage around Elena's head with practiced hands. "Very lucky. Most who wander onto this land don't make it past the tree line." "Why does it matter that I'm human?" Elena asked, wincing as the bandage tightened. "What is this place?" The healer's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "That is not my story to tell," she said quietly, "but I will say this. Whatever happened in that hall tonight, it has never happened before. Not once. Not in all the years I have served this pack." Elena did not understand what the woman meant, and she was far too exhausted and frightened to ask further questions. She let herself be led to a small room with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the dark forest beyond. The door was not locked, but 2 guards stood outside it, silent and watchful. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her trembling hands, replaying the strange moment in the hall over and over in her mind. The tall, cold man, with the storm-gray eyes, who had looked ready to end her life one second and had turned away the next, as though something inside him had broken loose and left him unable to follow through. Elena did not know his name yet. She did not know that the pack called him their king, or that the creature living inside him had never once shown restraint before tonight. All she knew was that somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and the confusion, something had shifted too, a strange and quiet pull she could not explain, as though her body had recognized something her mind had not yet caught up to. Outside her window, the fog rolled low across the treetops, and somewhere in the depths of that ancient stone fortress, Cale Ashgrove stood alone in his private chambers, staring at his own reflection in a darkened window, trying to understand why, for the first time in his life, the beast inside him had chosen not to fight. He pressed a hand against the glass, his reflection staring back at him, with the same confusion twisting behind his eyes. Something about the woman they had dragged into his hall tonight had reached a part of him that had been locked away for years, a part he had believed no longer existed. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion, a momentary lapse brought on by the storm outside. But deep down, in a place he refused to acknowledge, Cale already suspected that his carefully controlled world was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine, and that the woman sleeping under guard just down the hall was somehow at the center of it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the Alpha King of Frostmoor did not sleep that night. He stood at his window until the first light of dawn broke over the trees, his mind circling the same unanswered question again and again. Why had the beast knelt, when it had never knelt for anyone before? Morning light spilled through the narrow window, waking Elena from a sleep so shallow it barely counted as rest. For a moment, she forgot where she was, and then the memory of the night before came rushing back. The crash, the chase through the trees, the cold gray eyes of the man who had almost decided her fate with a single word. She sat up quickly, wincing at the dull ache still lingering in her shoulder, and looked around the small stone room as though seeing it clearly for the first time. There was a wooden table with a basin of water, a folded set of plain clothing, and a tray of food that had not been there when she fell asleep. Someone had come in while she slept. The thought sent a chill through her, and she glanced toward the door, relieved to see it was still closed, still guarded from the sound of low voices outside. She washed her face, changed into the clean clothes, and forced herself to eat a few bites of bread and fruit, though her stomach was tight with nerves. She had no idea what was going to happen to her. She had no idea if the strange man from the hall, the one everyone had bowed their heads to, was going to walk through that door and decide she was no longer worth keeping alive. A knock startled her before the door opened, revealing not Cale, but a young woman with warm brown eyes and hair pulled back in a loose braid. She introduced herself as Ivy, one of the pack members assigned to look after Elena while she remained under guard. "You're not what I expected," Ivy said, studying her with open curiosity. "Most humans who end up here are terrified out of their minds. You're just quiet." "I'm terrified," Elena admitted. "I'm just too tired to show it anymore." Ivy laughed softly, a sound that eased some of the tension in the room. She explained, carefully and in simple terms, that Elena was currently a guest of the Frostmoor Pack, a community of werewolves who had lived hidden from human society for generations. She explained that crossing pack land was normally treated as a serious offense, and that what had happened in the hall the night before, the Alpha choosing mercy instead of punishment, was almost unheard of. "Why?" Elena asked. "Why did he let me live?" Ivy's expression shifted, something careful and thoughtful crossing her face. "I don't know," she said honestly. "None of us do. But the whole pack is talking about it. Cale doesn't show weakness. He doesn't hesitate. Yet last night, he stood in front of you, and something inside him stopped completely." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. She thought about the strange stillness in his eyes, the way his hands had curled into fists as though he were fighting against something only he could feel. She had assumed it was anger. Now she was not so sure. Ivy stayed with her through the morning, answering questions when she could, and dodging others with practiced ease, clearly under instruction not to reveal too much. Elena learned that the pack was ruled entirely by Cale, that his word was law, and that he had never chosen a mate, despite years of pressure from the pack elders to secure an heir. She learned that something the pack called the beast lived inside every wolf, an instinctive, powerful force that could overwhelm even the strongest of them if provoked. "His beast is different," Ivy said quietly, almost as though she were afraid to be overheard. "Stronger, more dangerous. It's never accepted anyone, not once." The words settled uneasily in Elena's chest, though she could not explain why. By midday, she was summoned again, this time not to the great hall but to a smaller study, lined with books and old maps, warmed by a fireplace that crackled softly in the corner. Cale was already there when she arrived, standing near the window with his back to the door, his posture rigid despite the calm of the room around him. He turned when she entered, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Elena studied his face in the daylight for the first time, noticing details she had missed the night before, the faint scar along his jaw, the tightness around his eyes that suggested he rarely allowed himself to rest. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. She obeyed, more out of exhaustion than obedience, and waited as he took the seat across from her, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet somehow could not. "I need to understand what happened last night," Cale said, his voice low and measured. "You are not from this world. You do not know what my kind are, or what it means for someone like me to stand before someone like you and feel nothing but calm." "I don't understand it either," Elena said honestly. "I thought you were going to kill me, and then you just stopped." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to explain further. But then he spoke, choosing his words carefully, describing in simple terms the concept of a fated bond, a connection some in his world believed existed between two people, meant to stand together for life. He explained that most considered it little more than legend, a story told to pups to explain why some mates seem to find each other so easily. He explained that he had never believed in it, not truly, not after everything he had lost. "And you think that's what this is?" Elena asked carefully. "Some kind of fate?" "I think," Cale said slowly, "that something happened last night that has never happened to me before, and I do not like not understanding why." Elena studied him for a long moment, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he kept, even while sitting only a few feet away from her. He did not seem like a man eager to embrace whatever strange connection had passed between them. If anything, he seemed like a man bracing against it, as though accepting it might cost him something he was not willing to lose. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "Do I go home? Do I stay here? Am I a prisoner?" "You are not a prisoner," Cale said, though the words came out stiffer than he intended. "But you cannot leave yet either, not until I understand what you are to this pack, and what danger might follow you if word spreads that a human walked onto Frostmoor land and lived to tell of it." The mention of danger sent a fresh wave of unease through Elena, and she wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "What kind of danger?" Cale hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. Finally, he explained, in careful terms, that Frostmoor was not the only pack in the region, that rival packs watched constantly for any weakness they could exploit, and that an unclaimed human, connected in any way to the Alpha King, would be seen as either a valuable prize or an easy target. "I never asked for any of this," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Neither did I," Cale replied, and for the briefest moment, something almost human flickered across his carefully guarded expression, a flicker of exhaustion, of a man who had spent years holding an entire pack together, with nothing but sheer will, and who had just been handed a problem he had no idea how to solve. They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, neither quite willing to break the quiet that had settled over the room. Elena found herself studying him without meaning to, noticing the way his hands rested carefully on his knees, controlled and deliberate, as though he did not trust himself to move without thinking it through first. "You're afraid of something," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the observation. Cale's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and guarded. "I am not afraid of anything." "Everyone is afraid of something," Elena said gently. "I've been afraid since the second I woke up in this place. I think you're afraid too. I just don't think you're used to admitting it." For a moment, she thought she had overstepped, that he would rise from his chair and end the conversation with the same cold authority he had shown in the hall. Instead, he simply looked at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he finally rose and walked back toward the window, putting distance between them once more. "You should rest," he said, his voice carefully even again, the brief crack in his composure sealed shut. "Ivy will show you to better quarters. You are a guest here for now, not a prisoner, that much I can promise you." Elena rose slowly, sensing the conversation was over, though questions still burned in her mind. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him, still standing at the window, his broad shoulders rigid against the pale afternoon light. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not killing me." Cale did not turn around, but she saw his hand tighten briefly against the windowsill before he answered. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "We do not yet know what any of this means." She left the room with his words echoing in her mind, uncertain whether they were meant as a warning or a promise. Either way, she understood one thing clearly, as Ivy led her down the corridor to a warmer, more comfortable set of quarters. Whatever strange connection had passed between them in that hall the night before, it was not something either of them could simply walk away from, no matter how much the Alpha King of Frostmoor might wish otherwise. That night, long after the castle had gone quiet, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of their conversation. She thought about the flicker of vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, so quickly hidden away again, and wondered how many years it had taken him to build walls that thick. She did not know yet what a fated bond truly meant, or what it would cost either of them to accept it. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that her life had changed the moment she crossed onto Frostmoor land, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. 3 days passed, and Frostmoor Castle had not stopped whispering. Elena could feel the eyes on her every time she walked through the halls, guards and staff alike watching with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief, as though she were some kind of puzzle they could not solve. She had grown used to the stares, though she had not grown used to the strange weight that seemed to settle over the entire castle whenever Kale was nearby. She saw him rarely, and always briefly. He would appear at the edge of a hallway, exchange a few clipped words with one of his guards, and disappear again, before she could gather the courage to speak to him. It was as though he were deliberately avoiding her, and in a strange way, that stung more than she expected it to. On the 4th morning, Ivy found her sitting by the window in her new quarters, staring out at the endless stretch of forest beyond the castle walls. "You look like you're plotting an escape," Ivy said, dropping into the chair across from her with an easy grin. "I'm just thinking," Elena admitted, "about how strange all of this is. 3 days ago, I didn't believe any of this existed. Now I'm living in a castle full of werewolves, and the man who almost killed me won't even look me in the eye anymore." Ivy's grin softened into something more sympathetic. "He's not avoiding you because he doesn't care," she said. "He's avoiding you because he cares more than he knows what to do with. That's not the same thing." Elena frowned, turning the words over in her mind. "How do you know that?" "Because I've served this pack my whole life," Ivy said, "and I've never once seen Cale Ashgrove unsettled by anything. Not battles, not politics, not the elders pushing him for an heir every single year. But you've had him pacing his study at midnight for 3 nights straight. The guards talk. Trust me, they talk." Before Elena could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. One of the castle guards, a broad-shouldered man named Finn, stood in the doorway with a grim expression on his face. "The Alpha wants both of you in the war room," Finn said. "Now." The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of unease through Elena, and she rose quickly, following Ivy and Finn through a maze of corridors she had not yet learned to navigate. The war room, when they reached it, was nothing like the warm study where she had spoken with Cale days before. This room was cold and utilitarian, dominated by a long table covered in maps, marked with symbols she did not understand. Cale stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 men Elena did not recognize, both dressed in the same dark uniform as the guards who had first captured her. His expression was harder than she had seen it before, his jaw set in a tight line that spoke of barely restrained tension. "There's been movement along the eastern border," Cale said without preamble, his eyes flicking briefly to Elena, before returning to the map spread before him. "Dusk Hollow scouts were spotted near the ridge last night, 2 of them. They didn't cross the line, but they didn't hide themselves either." "You think they know about her?" one of the men said, nodding toward Elena. "I think it's possible," Cale replied grimly. "Word travels fast, even across pack borders. If Dusk Hollow has heard even a rumor of what happened in this hall 4 nights ago, they'll want to know more, and if they learn the truth, they'll see an opportunity." Elena's stomach twisted into a hard knot. What kind of opportunity? Cale's eyes met hers directly for the first time in days, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "A weakness," he said simply. "In our world, a bond like the one that formed between us is rare. It's also valuable and vulnerable. If Dusk Hollow believes you matter to me, they will not hesitate to use that against Frostmoor." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling heavily over everyone present. Elena had spent the last few days trying to convince herself that she was simply an unfortunate accident, caught up in a world she did not belong to. Hearing Cale speak so plainly about the danger she now represented made that comforting lie impossible to maintain any longer. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly, echoing the same words she had spoken to him days before. "I know," Cale said, his voice softening slightly, though the tension in his shoulders did not ease. "But whether either of us asked for it does not change the reality we are facing now." One of the men at the table, older and graying at the temples, cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Alpha, if I may, the safest option would be to send her far from Frostmoor entirely. Somewhere, Dusk Hollow could never trace her back to this pack." Elena felt a flicker of hope at the suggestion, a chance to simply disappear back into the ordinary world she had come from, away from castles and bonds and men who commanded entire packs with a single word. But Cale's expression darkened further, and he shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "If the bond is real, distance will not protect her. It may make things worse. A faded bond does not simply fade because two people are separated. If anything, the pull only grows stronger, and that would leave her alone and undefended exactly when she needs protection the most." The older man did not argue further, though his expression remained troubled. Elena studied Cale carefully, noticing the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale with the effort of staying composed. Whatever decision he was wrestling with, it clearly went far beyond simple pack politics. "So what do we do?" Ivy asked, breaking the tense silence. Cale straightened, his composure sliding back into place like armor. "For now, she remains here, under guard, with restricted movement outside the castle walls. I will increase patrols along the eastern border and send word to our allies to watch for any unusual activity from Dusk Hollow." "And the ceremony pressure from the elders?" the older man asked carefully. "They will want answers soon, Alpha. They have waited years for you to name an heir, and now that word has spread of what happened in the hall, they will not let this rest quietly." Cale's jaw tightened again, and for the first time, Elena saw something close to genuine frustration cross his face. "The elders will have their answers when I am ready to give them," he said, his voice low and final. "Not before." The meeting ended shortly after, the men filing out of the war room with quiet murmurs among themselves, leaving Elena, Ivy, and Cale alone in the cold, map-covered room. Ivy hesitated near the door, glancing between the two of them, before quietly excusing herself, leaving Elena standing awkwardly near the long table, while Cale remained at its head, staring down at the markings without truly seeing them. "You're worried," Elena said softly, breaking the silence. "I am always worried," Cale replied without looking up. "It comes with leading a pack that depends on me to keep them safe." "That's not what I meant," Elena said, taking a small step closer despite the guarded tension radiating off him. "You're worried about me, about what's happening between us. I can see it every time you look at me and then look away like you're trying to convince yourself it isn't real." Cale finally lifted his eyes to hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt smaller than it had in days, though neither moved to close it further. "I have seen what happens when bonds like this are used as weapons," Cale said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I will not let that happen to you." "Then let me help," Elena said. "Don't just lock me away in a room and hope the danger passes on its own. Let me understand what I'm part of, so I can protect myself too." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a flicker of respect breaking through the guarded caution he had worn like a second skin since the moment they met. He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing her words carefully, before finally giving a slow, reluctant nod. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will show you what this pact truly is, what we protect, and what we stand to lose if Dusk Hollow moves against us." It was not the reassurance Elena had hoped for, but it was something, a small crack in the wall he had built so carefully around himself. As she left the war room that evening, she found herself replaying his words again and again, the quiet promise beneath his careful caution, and the strange, growing certainty that whatever bound them together was only just beginning to reveal itself. The next morning arrived colder than the ones before it, frost clinging to the windows of Frostmoor Castle in delicate patterns that caught the early light. Elena dressed quickly in the warm clothing Ivy had brought her the night before, her mind still turning over Cale's promise from the war room. Today, he had said, he would show her what the pact truly was. She met him in the courtyard just after sunrise, surprised to find him waiting without the usual entourage of guards and advisors that typically surrounded him. He wore simpler clothing than she had seen him in before, dark and practical, and for the first time since they had met, he looked less like a king and more like an ordinary man standing in the cold morning air. "You're punctual," he said, a note of something almost like approval in his voice. "I didn't want to give you a reason to change your mind," Elena replied. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, before disappearing just as quickly. He gestured for her to follow, leading her out through a side gate and into the forest that surrounded the castle grounds. She hesitated at the tree line, memories of her terrified flight through those same woods still fresh in her mind, but Cale's steady presence beside her eased some of the tension in her chest. "You won't be in danger this time," he said, as though sensing her unease. "Not from anyone in this forest, at least." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of frost beneath their boots, and the distant call of birds waking in the treetops. Elena found herself studying him as they walked, noticing the way his shoulders relaxed slightly the further they moved from the castle, as though the weight of leadership loosened its grip on him with every step into the wild. "This land has belonged to my family for generations," Cale said eventually, breaking the silence. "My grandfather built the castle you saw 4 nights ago. My father expanded our territory through alliances rather than conflict, something not every pack leader chooses to do. When I took over as Alpha, I inherited both his legacy and his enemies." "How old were you?" Elena asked carefully. 22, Cale said, his voice flat, though something tightened behind his eyes. "My father died defending our northern border from a pack that no longer exists. I became Alpha the same week I buried him." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she simply listened as he continued walking, the story unfolding slowly and reluctantly, as though each word cost him something to share. He told her about the years that followed, about proving himself to elders who doubted a young Alpha could hold Frostmoor together, about the enemies who tested his authority again and again, until none dared question it further. "That's a lot to carry alone," Elena said quietly. "I was never alone," Cale replied, though his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "I had my pack. I had responsibility. That was enough." They reached a clearing deep in the forest, where a small waterfall spilled over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. The sight was breathtaking, quiet and untouched, and Elena found herself momentarily forgetting the danger and uncertainty that had defined the last few days of her life. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "My mother used to bring me here," Cale said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. Before she passed, she said this was the one place in Frostmoor where the weight of being Alpha didn't exist yet, where I could just be her son instead of the future of an entire pack. Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission. He was staring at the water, his expression distant, caught somewhere between the present and a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "You don't talk about her often, do you?" Elena said gently. "I don't talk about any of this," Cale admitted, meeting her eyes. "I don't know why I'm telling you now. Maybe because for the first time in years, you don't have to carry it alone," Elena offered. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise followed by something deeper, something he seemed to be fighting against with everything he had. He looked away first, turning back toward the water, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining his usual composure. "The bond between us," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. "It is not something either of us chose. But I need you to understand what it means, truly means, before either of us decides what to do about it." Elena nodded, sensing the importance of what he was about to say, and waited quietly as he continued. "A fated bond connects two people on a level deeper than choice or attraction," Cale explained. "It ties our lives together in ways that cannot easily be undone. If I claim you as my mate, you become part of this pack permanently, bound to its protection and its dangers both. There is no version of that choice that keeps you safe from everything Frostmoor faces." "And if you don't claim me?" Elena asked. "Then the bond remains unfinished," Cale said. "Painful for both of us, but survivable. You could leave, return to your life. Eventually, the pull would fade, though never completely." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for some sign of what he actually wanted, beneath the careful, measured way he laid out her options, like a man presenting evidence, rather than sharing his own heart. "What do you want, Kale?" she asked directly. "Not what's safest. Not what the elders expect. What do you actually want?" For a long moment, he did not answer, his eyes fixed on the water rushing over the rocks below. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the careful control he wore, like armor everywhere else. "I have spent years telling myself I did not want this," he admitted. "That a mate was a weakness I could not afford, a vulnerability my enemies would exploit. I convinced myself I was better off ruling alone. And then you walked into my hall 4 nights ago, and everything I believed about myself became a question I no longer knew how to answer." Elena felt her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of his honesty settling over her like the cold morning air. "That's not really an answer," she said softly. Kale turned to face her fully, closing the distance between them, until only a few feet remained. "I want," he said slowly, deliberately, "to stop pretending that I don't already know what my answer is." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to fully claim yet. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the fear and uncertainty still tangled up inside her, a fragile hope she had not expected to find in a world so unfamiliar and dangerous. Before either of them could say anything further, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable, the sound of a branch breaking under weight that did not belong there. Kale's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the vulnerability of moments before, replaced by sharp, controlled alertness. He stepped in front of Elena without hesitation, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, his voice low and commanding. Elena's heart pounded as she watched him study the shadows between the trees, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. For a long moment, nothing happened, the forest falling unnaturally silent around them, even the birds overhead going quiet. Then, from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, a lone figure stepped into view, dressed in the same dark uniform Elena had seen on the men who had first captured her, though this man wore markings on his jacket she did not recognize. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved from Kale to Elena and back again, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. "Alpha Ashgrove," the man said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "I had heard the rumors, but I did not quite believe them until now." Kale's body went rigid, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "You're a long way from Dusk Hollow territory, Callum." "Just taking in the scenery," Callum said, his eyes lingering pointedly on Elena. "Though I have to admit, the view is far more interesting than I expected." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Elena felt Kale's entire body tense further in front of her, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest, that she felt more than heard. Whatever fragile, hopeful moment they had shared beside the waterfall moments ago had shattered completely, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of the danger Kale had warned her about from the very beginning. The peaceful morning in the forest was over, and Elena understood, with sudden and chilling clarity, that Dusk Hollow already knew far more than any of them had hoped. Callum did not move any closer, though his presence alone seemed to fill the clearing with tension so thick Elena could barely breathe. Kale stood utterly still in front of her, every line of his body coiled with restrained power, his eyes locked on the intruder with a focus that made the air feel colder than the morning frost around them. "You are trespassing on Frostmoor land," Kale said, his voice low and controlled, though Elena could feel the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "I suggest you explain yourself quickly." Callum spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence, though the calculating look in his eyes never wavered. "I was simply passing through," he said. "Dusk Hollow has as much right to travel these borders as Frostmoor does to guard them. Or has that changed since your father's time, Alpha?" "You know exactly why I'm asking," Kale said. "2 of your scouts were seen near the eastern ridge 3 nights ago. Now you're standing in my private forest, less than a day later. That is not coincidence." "Careful," Callum said, his smile widening slightly. "Accusations like that could be seen as an act of aggression between packs. My Alpha would not take kindly to that, especially not while Frostmoor is dealing with such Interesting developments. His eyes flicked deliberately toward Elena again, and this time, Cale's entire body seemed to vibrate with barely restrained anger, a low growl escaping him that made the hair on Elena's arms stand on end. She had never heard a sound like that from him before, something ancient and dangerous rumbling just beneath his human voice. "Leave," Cale said, each word carved from ice. "Now, while I am still willing to let you walk away." Callum studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to push further, before finally offering a shallow, mocking bow. "As you wish, Alpha Ashgrove. Though I suspect this will not be the last conversation we have on this matter." He disappeared back into the tree line as silently as he had appeared, leaving Cale standing rigid and furious in the clearing, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that Elena could see the tension trembling through his forearms. It took several long moments before he finally turned to face her, his expression carefully composed once more, though his eyes still burned with barely contained anger. "We need to get back to the castle," he said, his voice tight. "Now." The walk back was tense and silent, Cale's pace quick and purposeful, his eyes constantly scanning the trees around them, as though expecting another ambush at any moment. Elena struggled to keep up, her mind racing with questions she knew better than to ask, until they were safely behind the castle's protective walls. The moment they returned, Cale summoned his advisors, and within the hour, the war room was once again filled with tense voices and worried faces. Elena sat quietly near the back of the room, listening as Cale relayed exactly what had happened in the clearing, watching the color drain from the faces of the older pack members as they processed the implications. "They know," the gray-haired advisor said grimly. "There's no other explanation for Callum showing himself so openly. Dusk Hollow wanted you to see them, Alpha. They wanted you to understand that they know exactly what she means to you. Which means they'll move quickly," another voice added, "before you have time to properly claim the bond and strengthen your position." Cale's jaw tightened, his hands pressed flat against the war table, as he studied the map spread before him, though his eyes seemed distant, calculating something far more complicated than troop movements and border patrols. "Increase patrols along every border, not just the eastern ridge," he said finally. "I want eyes on every approach to this castle, day and night, no exceptions." The advisors nodded and began discussing logistics, but Elena found her attention drawn instead to Cale's expression, the careful mask of authority he wore even now, even as fear and calculation warred behind his eyes. She understood, watching him, that the peaceful morning by the waterfall, the honest vulnerability he had shown her, felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime already. Later that evening, after the war room had finally emptied and the castle had settled into an uneasy quiet, Elena found Cale alone in his study, standing at the same window where she had first seen him staring out into the darkness after their initial meeting. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude on whatever thoughts occupied him so completely, before finally stepping inside. "You should be resting," Cale said without turning around, clearly aware of her presence despite not looking at her. "So should you," Elena replied, moving to stand a respectful distance away. "But here we both are." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips as he finally turned to face her. The exhaustion in his expression was more visible now than she had seen it before, the weight of leadership and impending danger settling heavily over his features. "I keep thinking about what you asked me this morning," he said quietly. "What I actually wanted, beneath everything else." "And?" Elena prompted gently. "And now Dusk Hollow knows exactly how to use that answer against me," Cale said, frustration bleeding into his voice for the first time since she had met him. "Every day I wait to claim this bond properly is another day they have to plan an attack. Every day I do claim it puts you at greater risk of becoming a target they cannot resist. So either way, I'm in danger," Elena said plainly. "Yes," Cale admitted, the honesty costing him visibly. "I am sorry. I wish I could offer you a version of this where that was not true." Elena crossed the room slowly, closing the distance between them until she stood only a few feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I didn't come to this world looking for safety, Cale," she said. "I came here running from a life that had already fallen apart. Whatever danger exists now, At least it exists alongside something that actually feels real. Cale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful composure, a flicker of the same vulnerability he had shown her by the waterfall that morning. "You are not what I expected," he admitted. "I have spent years assuming a mate would be a weakness. Something to protect, something that would slow me down in the moments I needed to act decisively." "And now?" Elena asked softly. "Now I am beginning to understand that perhaps strength is not the same as standing alone," Cale said, his voice rough with an emotion he clearly was not used to expressing. Perhaps it never was. The space between them felt charged with something neither of them had fully acknowledged yet, a pull that went beyond fear, or danger, or the careful politics of packs and borders. Elena felt her heart pounding as Cale reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, before gently brushing a strand of hair back from her face, his touch far more careful than she expected from someone capable of such controlled violence. "I cannot promise you safety," he said quietly. "Not with Dusk Hollow watching, not with the elders demanding answers I am not yet ready to give, but I can promise you this: whatever happens next, you will not face it alone, not anymore." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened since her car had spun off that icy road only days before. She had lost everything familiar in an instant, and yet somehow, standing in this cold stone study with a man the entire world feared, she felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon. She felt like she belonged somewhere. "Thank you," she whispered. Cale's hand lingered gently against her cheek for a moment longer, before he finally stepped back, the familiar mask of controlled authority settling back over his features, though something softer remained visible in his eyes now, something that had not been there before their conversation began. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, I will speak with the elders. It is time they understood exactly what they are dealing with, and exactly what I intend to do about it." Elena nodded, though as she left his study and made her way back through the quiet, torchlit corridors, she could not shake the growing certainty that whatever decision Cale was about to make would change everything. Not just for the two of them, but for the entire pack that depended on him to lead them safely through whatever storm was building on the horizon. The great hall of Frostmoor Castle had never felt so crowded. Elena stood near the side entrance, watching as pack elders filed in one by one, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Word had spread quickly through the castle that Cale intended to address the entire council regarding the human woman who had somehow tamed his beast, and it seemed every senior member of Frostmoor had come to witness the moment for themselves. Ivy stood beside her, offering a reassuring squeeze of her hand as the last of the elders took their seats along the long stone benches lining the hall. "Just breathe," Ivy whispered. "Whatever happens in here, you are not facing it alone." Elena appreciated the sentiment, though nothing about the sea of unfamiliar, judgmental faces made breathing feel particularly easy. She had spent the previous night lying awake, replaying Cale's words in the study, the quiet promise that she would not face whatever came next alone. Now, watching the tension building in the hall, she wondered exactly how much that promise would be tested. Cale entered from a side chamber, dressed formally for the first time since Elena had arrived, dark clothing accented with silver that marked his authority even before he spoke a single word. The murmuring elders fell silent instantly, their attention fixed entirely on their alpha as he moved to stand before them, his posture radiating the same controlled authority Elena had witnessed in their very first meeting. "I know why you have gathered here today," Cale began, his voice carrying easily through the stone hall without needing to be raised. "Rumors have spread faster than facts, and I intend to correct that now, before misunderstanding becomes something more dangerous." A woman near the front of the gathered elders rose slowly, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression carrying the weight of decades spent advising Frostmoor's leadership. "Alpha," she said, "we have waited years for you to name a mate, to secure the future of this pack. Now we are told your beast knelt before an unclaimed human, a stranger with no knowledge of our ways. Explain to us why this should bring the council anything but concern." "Because it is the truth, Elder Nora," Cale said simply, "and because dismissing the truth out of fear will not protect this pack. It will only weaken us." Murmurs rippled through the gathered elders, some skeptical, others clearly intrigued despite themselves. Elder Nora studied Cale carefully before turning her sharp gaze toward Elena, who fought the instinct to shrink back under the weight of such open scrutiny. "Bring her forward," Nora said. Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded toward Elena, and she forced herself to walk forward on legs that felt far less steady than she wanted them to be. She stopped beside Cale, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes settling over her, judging, assessing, weighing whether she was worthy of the position that seemed to be forming around her, whether she fully understood it or not. "You claim no knowledge of our world before 4 nights ago," Nora said, addressing Elena directly for the first time. "Yet somehow, you walked into this very hall and did what no one else has managed in the Alpha's entire lifetime. Explain yourself." "I can't," Elena admitted honestly, deciding that pretending to understand something she truly did not would serve no one well. "I didn't do anything except hold out my hand because I was scared and confused, and it was the only instinct I had left. I don't know why it mattered. I just know that it did." Her honesty seemed to catch several of the elders off guard, a few exchanging glances that suggested grudging respect despite their obvious wariness. Nora studied her for a long moment longer before finally turning back toward Cale. "And you, Alpha? What do you intend to do with this? Development?" Cale straightened, his eyes sweeping across the gathered council with the same commanding presence Elena had witnessed since the very first night. "I intend to claim the bond properly," he said, his voice carrying no hesitation despite the weight of the declaration. "Elena will become Luna of Frostmoor, in accordance with our traditions and our laws." The hall erupted into a wave of murmurs and reactions, some approving, others sharply concerned. Nora raised a hand, and the noise gradually settled, though the tension in the room remained thick enough to feel physically. "You understand the danger this invites," Nora said carefully. "Dusk Hollow already suspects the truth. Formalizing this bond will remove any doubt. They will see it as confirmation of a weakness they can exploit." "They will see it as confirmation of a strength they cannot break," Cale countered firmly. "A fated bond is not a vulnerability, Elder Nora. It is the foundation this pack was built upon generations ago, before fear taught us to see connection as something to hide rather than celebrate." Elena felt a surge of something warm and unexpected at his words, watching him defend not just her, but the very idea of what they represented together, with a conviction that left little room for doubt. Whatever uncertainty he had carried in the privacy of his study the night before, none of it showed now, standing before the council that held the power to challenge his every decision. Nora studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the political and practical implications of his declaration, before finally inclining her head slightly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of reluctant approval. "The council will not stand in your way, Alpha," she said. "But we will expect proper protections to be put in place. If Dushkalo moves against this pack because of this bond, the consequences will fall on more than just the two of you." "I am aware of the responsibility," Cale said evenly. "I would not have made this declaration without understanding exactly what it demands of me." The meeting continued for another hour, discussions shifting toward border security, patrol schedules, and the formal ceremony that would need to take place to properly claim the bond between Cale and Elena, according to pack tradition. Elena listened as best she could, though much of the discussion involved customs and terminology she was still learning to understand, her mind circling back again and again to the moment Cale had declared his intentions so plainly before the entire council. When the meeting finally ended, and the elders began filing out of the hall, Elena found herself alone with Cale for the first time since he had made his declaration. He turned to her slowly, studying her expression with careful attention, as though searching for any sign of regret or fear she might be hesitant to voice aloud. "You didn't ask me first," Elena said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only quiet curiosity. "No," Cale admitted. "I should have. But watching Nora question whether you were worthy of consideration, I found I could not stay silent about what I already knew to be true." "And what is that?" Elena asked softly. Cale stepped closer, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "That, whatever fear I carried about accepting this bond, matters far less than the certainty I feel every time I am near you," he said. I spent years convincing myself that ruling alone made me strong. I understand now that I was simply afraid of exactly this moment, standing before you, admitting that I do not want to face what comes next without you beside me." Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, so different from the cold, guarded authority he had shown the entire pack only moments before. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of To Our Chenal, of everything I still don't understand about this world. But I'm not scared of you, Kale. Not anymore." "Good," Kale said softly, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. "Because whatever comes next, we face it together. That much I promise you." The formal ceremony, the elders had explained, would take place within the week, giving Frostmoor time to strengthen its defenses and prepare for whatever response To Our Chenal might choose to make. As Elena walked with Kale out of the great hall that evening, the weight of everything ahead of them settling heavily over her shoulders, she found herself holding tightly to the one certainty she had discovered in the middle of so much uncertainty. Whatever storm was coming, she would not face it as a frightened stranger stumbling through unfamiliar woods anymore. She would face it as Kale's chosen partner, standing beside a man who had finally stopped running from the very thing that made him strongest. The days leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur of preparation, and Elena found herself swept into a world of customs and traditions she was only beginning to understand. Ivy remained close by her side through most of it, patiently explaining the significance of each ritual, each garment, each carefully worded phrase Elena would need to recite during the formal claiming. But beneath the preparations, an undercurrent of tension ran through the entire castle. Patrols had doubled along every border. Guards moved with a watchfulness that had not existed before Callum's appearance in the forest. Elena often caught snippets of hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room, and she understood, without needing to be told directly, that the threat from To Our Chenal had not diminished simply because Kale had made his intentions known to the council. On the 5th evening before the ceremony, Elena found Kale in the castle's private library, a room she had not yet explored, filled floor to ceiling with old books and scrolls that seemed to stretch back generations. He sat near the fireplace, a leather-bound journal open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the flames rather than the pages before him. "You look far away," Elena said softly, settling into the chair across from him. Kale blinked, seeming to return from wherever his thoughts had carried him, and offered her a tired smile. "I was thinking about my father," he admitted, "about the last conversation we had before he died." Elena waited quietly, sensing he needed the space to continue without pressure. "He told me that leading a pack was not about being feared," Kale said slowly. "It was about being trusted enough that fear became unnecessary. I did not understand what he meant at the time. I was too young, too eager to prove myself capable of holding this castle together." "Do you understand it now?" Elena asked. "I am beginning to," Kale said, closing the journal gently. "For years, I believed that keeping everyone at a distance, including myself from my own feelings, was the only way to protect this pack from vulnerability. I built walls so carefully that even I forgot what it felt like to trust anyone with what was on the other side of them." Elena studied him carefully, understanding that he was working his way toward something important, something he had perhaps never spoken aloud to anyone before. "What changed?" she asked gently. Kale's eyes met hers, steady and unguarded, in a way she had rarely seen from him. "You did," he said simply. "Not because you tried to change anything, because you never once looked at me the way everyone else does, with fear or calculation or expectation. You looked at me like a person, someone capable of being more than the title everyone else insists on defining me by." The vulnerability in his admission settled warmly in Elena's chest, and she reached across the small distance between them, taking his hand gently in hers. "You are more than the title," she said softly. "You always were. You just needed someone to remind you of that." Kale's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the comfortable silence between them. Finally, he drew in a slow breath and continued, his voice carrying a weight of memory Elena had not expected. "Before my father died," he said, "there was another, a woman my family believed would make a suitable mate, chosen through alliance and political convenience, rather than any true bond. I was young, and foolish enough to believe that perhaps affection could grow from arrangement, if given enough time. Elena listened quietly, sensing the difficulty behind every word he shared. She never wanted me, Cale continued. She wanted the power that came with standing beside an alpha. When my father died, and I inherited leadership sooner than anyone expected, she saw an opportunity to manipulate that grief for her own advantage, working quietly with rivals who sought to weaken Frostmore from within. What happened to her? Elena asked carefully. She was discovered before real damage could be done, Cale said, his jaw tightening at the memory, but the betrayal left something broken in me that I did not know how to repair. I convinced myself that if someone I trusted enough to consider a mate could so easily use that trust as a weapon, then trust itself was the vulnerability, not the person exploiting it. I closed myself off from everyone after that. My beast became a reflection of that decision, violent toward anyone who dared come close enough to threaten the walls I had built. Elena felt her heart aching for the young man who had lost his father and been betrayed by someone he had trusted, all within the same painful chapter of his life. She understood now, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly why his wolf had never knelt for anyone before her, why every potential mate before her had been met with violence rather than acceptance. I'm not her, Elena said quietly, though the words felt inadequate to the depth of what he had shared. I know, Cale said, his voice softening. I have known it since the moment I felt my beast still in your presence, instead of raging against it. But knowing something and allowing yourself to believe it fully are not always the same thing. I am still learning to trust that difference. Take whatever time you need, Elena said gently. I'm not going anywhere, Cale. Not because of some bond neither of us fully understands, but because I choose to stay. Every single day since I met you, that choice has only become clearer. Something shifted visibly in Cale's expression, the careful guardedness he had carried through their entire conversation, finally giving way to something warmer, something closer to genuine peace. He lifted her hand gently and pressed a soft kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so tender it caught Elena completely off guard. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying, even after everything I have shared tonight. Thank you for trusting me with it, Elena replied. They sat together by the fire for a while longer, the conversation drifting toward lighter topics, memories of childhood, small details about the world Elena had left behind, questions Cale asked with genuine curiosity about her life before Frostmore had become her unexpected home. For the first time since the crash that had brought her into this world, Elena felt something close to real comfort settle over her, a quiet sense that despite everything uncertain and dangerous still looming ahead, she had found something worth holding on to. Later that night, as she made her way back to her quarters, Elena passed by an open window overlooking the eastern forest, the same direction Duskalo's territory lay hidden beyond the tree line. She paused for a moment, staring out into the darkness, and felt an unexpected chill crawl across her skin, as though something out there in the shadows was watching, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. She told herself it was simply nerves, the natural anxiety of someone still adjusting to a world full of danger she barely understood. But as she continued down the corridor toward her room, she could not quite shake the feeling that the quiet peace she and Cale had found tonight was only a brief pause before the storm that everyone in Frostmore Castle knew, deep down, was already gathering on the horizon. 2 days before the ceremony, the sky over Frostmore turned a heavy shade of gray, thick clouds rolling in from the north, as though the weather itself sensed the tension building within the castle walls. Elena stood in the courtyard, watching guards move with quick, purposeful steps as they reinforced the outer gates, their expressions tight with a seriousness that had not been there even a week before. Ivy found her there, a woolen shawl draped over her arm. You'll catch a chill standing out here, she said, wrapping the shawl gently around Elena's shoulders. Cale would never forgive me if you fell ill before the ceremony. I keep thinking about what Elder Nora said, Elena admitted, pulling the shawl tighter against the cold wind. About the consequences falling on more than just the two of us, if Duskalo decides to act. Ivy's expression grew more serious, the easy warmth she usually carried dimming slightly. Duskalo has wanted an excuse to challenge Frostmore's borders for years, she said. Kale's father kept them in check through sheer strength and careful alliances. Kale has done the same, but a claimed mate, especially one without pack blood, gives them something they have never had before, a perceived weakness they can use to justify aggression. Do you think they'll actually attack? Elena asked quietly. Ivy hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much honesty to offer. I think Callum showing himself so openly in the forest was not an accident, she said finally. I think Dusk Hollow already made their decision the moment they learned the truth. The only question now is timing. The words settled uneasily in Elena's stomach, and she found her gaze drifting toward the eastern tree line, half expecting to see shadows moving among the trees, even in broad daylight. She thought about the strength and confidence Kale had shown before the council, his unwavering conviction that a bond should be celebrated rather than hidden. She wondered now whether that conviction would be enough to protect an entire pack from whatever Dusk Hollow intended. That evening, Kale summoned his senior guards and advisors once more, and Elena was invited to join the gathering for the first time, as more than simply an observer. The war room felt different now, the maps spread across the table marked with new symbols, indicating recent scout reports and suspected troop movements along the border. Dusk Hollow has been gathering numbers near the ridge for the past 2 days, one of the scouts reported grimly. Not an official war party, not yet. But enough that it cannot be mistaken for routine patrol. They're waiting for the ceremony, Kale said, his voice steady despite the concern evident in his eyes. They know a claiming ceremony draws the pack together in one place, leaves us vulnerable, in ways we would not be otherwise. Then postpone it, one of the advisors suggested. Delay the ceremony until the threat has passed. Kale's jaw tightened, and Elena watched him carefully, sensing the internal struggle behind his controlled expression. Delaying gives them exactly what they want, he said finally. It shows hesitation, uncertainty, weakness. They will exploit regardless of whether we proceed or not. If we are going to face this threat, I would rather face it having already secured what matters most. Elena felt a surge of something fierce and protective rise within her at his words, understanding fully now the weight of what he was choosing to risk, not just for himself, but for her, and for the entire pack that depended on his leadership. Then let me help, she said, drawing surprised glances from several of the advisors seated around the table. I'm not a warrior, and I don't pretend to understand half of what's happening in this room, but I refuse to sit quietly in a room somewhere while people I care about put themselves in danger on my behalf. Kale studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, pride and worry tangled together in equal measure. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Elena, he said carefully. I'm not making it lightly, Elena replied firmly. I'm making it because I refuse to be treated like something fragile that needs to be hidden away every time danger appears. I survived a car crash, and days lost in unfamiliar woods before any of you found me. I am not as breakable as everyone here seems to assume. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, though Elena thought she caught the faintest hint of approval in the expression of the older advisor, who had spoken earlier about postponing the ceremony. Kale's expression softened slightly, though the worry in his eyes remained. We will discuss your role carefully, he said finally, but I will not have you standing on any front line, bond or no bond. Is that understood? Understood, Elena agreed, though something in her tone suggested she fully intended to find whatever middle ground existed between staying completely safe and staying completely useless. The meeting continued for another hour, strategies discussed, patrol schedules adjusted, contingencies planned for scenarios ranging from a small border skirmish to a full assault during the ceremony itself. Elena listened carefully, absorbing as much as she could, determined to understand this world well enough to protect herself and contribute meaningfully to whatever came next. Later that night, long after the war room had emptied, Elena found herself unable to sleep, her mind circling endlessly through everything she had learned and everything still uncertain about the days ahead. She rose from her bed and made her way quietly through the castle corridors, eventually finding herself outside Kale's private chambers, a soft light still glowing beneath the door. She knocked gently, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal Kale, still dressed, his hair slightly disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly in frustration or worry. You should be resting, he said, though he stepped aside to let her in without hesitation. So should you, Elena replied, echoing words they had exchanged before. But here we both are. A tired smile crossed his face as he closed the door behind her, the two of them standing together in the quiet privacy of his chambers, the weight of everything ahead, pressing gently against the comfortable silence between them. I keep thinking about what could go wrong, Cale admitted, running a hand through his hair once more. Every scenario, every possible failure. It has been years since I felt this uncertain about anything. That's because for years, you only had to worry about yourself and your pack, Elena said gently. Now you're worrying about me too. That's not weakness, Cale. That's just what it means to care about someone. Cale studied her carefully, something warm and grateful passing behind his eyes. I never thought I would say this, he admitted, but I am glad you crossed onto Frostmoor land that night, despite everything it has brought with it. I cannot imagine facing what comes next without you standing beside me. Elena crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, feeling him relax slightly into the embrace, the tension of the day finally easing from his shoulders, even if only for a moment. Whatever happens, she said quietly against his chest, we face it together. You promised me that already. I'm holding you to it. I intend to keep that promise, Cale murmured, pressing a gentle kiss against the top of her head, no matter what Duskhollow throws at us. Outside the castle walls, hidden deep within the shadows of the eastern forest, Duskhollow scouts continued their careful preparations, watching Frostmoor's increased patrols with calculating patience, waiting for the exact moment the ceremony would begin, the moment when Frostmoor's attention would be focused entirely on celebration rather than defense. The storm Elena and Cale had both sensed building on the horizon was closer now than either of them fully realized, and within 2 days, it would finally break. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a strange, deceptive calm, the heavy clouds from days before finally clearing, to reveal a pale, watery sun rising over Frostmoor Castle. Elena stood in her quarters, dressed in a gown of deep silver that Ivy had helped her into hours earlier, her hands trembling slightly, despite the quiet determination she had carried with her since the war room meeting 2 nights prior. You look every bit the Luna this pack needs, Ivy said softly, adjusting a final fold of fabric near Elena's shoulder. Cale is a lucky man, even if it took him nearly killing you to realize it. Elena managed a small, nervous laugh, grateful for Ivy's steady presence in a morning that felt increasingly surreal. Do you think everything will go smoothly? She asked, unable to fully mask the worry beneath the question. Ivy's expression grew more serious, though she offered a reassuring squeeze of Elena's hand. Frostmoor has doubled every patrol, positioned guards at every entrance, and prepared for the worst possible outcome, she said. Whatever happens today, you will not be unprotected. The ceremony was set to take place in the Great Hall, the same room where Elena had first stood trembling before Cale and his council, only weeks earlier. Now, that same hall had been transformed, silver and white draped along the stone walls, candles lit in careful rows, leading toward the raised platform where Cale would formally claim her as his Luna before the entire gathered pack. As Elena made her way toward the hall, guided carefully by Ivy through the castle's quiet corridors, she felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment settling over her. The crash, the terrified flight through unfamiliar woods, the cold gray eyes that had chosen mercy instead of judgment, and every quiet, honest conversation that had slowly built trust between two people who had never expected to find each other at all. The Great Hall was already full when they arrived, pack members filling every available space, their expressions a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. Elena spotted Cale standing near the platform, dressed in formal attire that made him look every bit the powerful alpha king his pack depended upon, though his eyes softened the moment they found hers across the crowded room. She made her way toward him, the crowd parting respectfully as she passed, until she finally stood before him on the raised platform, close enough to see the quiet emotion swimming behind his composed expression. You look beautiful, Cale said softly, his voice carrying only for her to hear. You look terrified, Elena replied with a small smile, noticing the tension still visible in the set of his shoulders. I am, he admitted quietly. But not of this, never of this. Elder Nora stepped forward to begin the ceremony, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall as she recited the traditional words that would bind Kale and Elena together in the eyes of the entire pack. Elena listened carefully, repeating the phrases Ivy had helped her memorize over the past several days, her voice growing steadier with each word, despite the nervous flutter still present in her chest. Just as Nora reached the final portion of the ceremony, the moment where Kale would formally claim the bond before his pack, a loud horn blast echoed from somewhere outside the castle walls, sharp and urgent, cutting through the solemn quiet of the hall like a blade. The hall erupted into immediate chaos, guards moving swiftly toward the exits, pack members exchanging alarmed glances, as the unmistakable sound of a second horn blast followed the first. Kale's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the tender warmth of moments before replaced by sharp, commanding authority. "Dus Kalo," he said grimly, already moving to address the gathered guards positioned near the hall's entrance. "They're attacking now, exactly as we feared." Elena felt her heart pounding as chaos swirled around her, guards rushing to their positions, elders calling out instructions to frightened pack members seeking shelter deeper within the castle. Kale turned to her, his expression torn between the fierce protectiveness she had come to recognize and the fear of losing whatever they had just begun to build together. "Stay close to Ivy," he said urgently. "Get to the lower chambers. I need to lead the defense." "No," Elena said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "I told you I wasn't going to hide, while people I care about fight for their lives. I meant that. Elena, this is not the time." "I'm not asking to fight on the front line," Elena interrupted, gripping his arm tightly. "But I refuse to sit somewhere safe while you face this alone. Let me help however I can, please." Kale studied her for a long, tense moment, torn between his instinct to protect her completely and the respect he had developed for her fierce determination over the past several weeks. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Stay with the healers," he said. "Help coordinate the wounded. It is dangerous, but far safer than the walls. That is the compromise I can offer you." Elena nodded quickly, understanding this was the most ground he was willing to give under the circumstances, and watched as he turned away, shouting orders to his guards with the same commanding authority she had witnessed in their very first meeting, though now that authority carried a fierce edge of desperation she had not seen before. The sounds of battle began echoing from beyond the castle walls within minutes, distant at first, then growing closer, as Dusk Hollow forces pressed against Frostmore's defenses. Elena made her way quickly to the healer's quarters, finding Mara, the older healer who had first tended her wounds weeks earlier, already preparing supplies with quick, practiced efficiency. "You can help by keeping everyone calm and organized," Mara said briskly, handing Elena a stack of clean bandages. "Panic kills more people in situations like this than actual wounds do." Elena nodded and threw herself into the work, grateful for something productive to occupy her trembling hands as the sounds of fighting grew louder outside. Wounded guards began arriving within the hour, some with minor injuries, others far more serious, and Elena worked tirelessly alongside Mara and several other healers, doing everything she could to help however her limited skills allowed. Hours passed in a blur of urgent activity, the castle shaking occasionally from the force of the battle raging beyond its walls. Elena caught fragments of news between patients, whispered updates from guards passing through, each report carrying its own mixture of hope and fear. Frostmore was holding its ground, but the fighting was fierce, and Dusk Hollow had brought far more numbers than anyone had anticipated. As afternoon shadows lengthened into evening, a guard burst into the healer's quarters, his face pale and urgent. "The Alpha," he said breathlessly. "He's leading a charge against their main force near the eastern gate. He needs reinforcements, but most of our guards are already committed elsewhere." Elena's heart lurched painfully in her chest, fear for Kale overwhelming every other concern. She thought about his promise, "Whatever happens, we face it together," and felt a fierce determination rise within her that she could not simply ignore. "Where exactly is the eastern gate from here?" she asked, already reaching for the sturdy cloak hanging near the door. Mara caught her arm firmly. "You cannot go out there, child. You have no training, no way to defend yourself against trained warriors." "I'm not going to fight," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with the admission. But I refuse to sit here doing nothing while he faces this alone. I promised him the same thing he promised me. Whatever happens, we face it together. Before Mara could argue further, Elena slipped out of the healer's quarters and made her way quickly through the chaotic castle corridors, following the sounds of distant fighting toward the eastern gate, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination that refused to let her turn back now, no matter how dangerous the path ahead had become. The eastern gate came into view as Elena rounded the final corner of the castle's outer wall, and the scene before her stole the breath from her lungs. Guards from both packs clashed fiercely near the gate's entrance, the air filled with shouted commands and the sounds of a struggle far more intense than anything she had imagined while working in the relative safety of the healer's quarters. She spotted Cale immediately, standing near the center of the conflict, directing his guards with sharp, decisive authority, even as he held his own ground against a pair of Dusk Hollow fighters pressing toward him. His movements were precise and controlled despite the chaos surrounding him, and Elena felt a strange mixture of terror and awe watching him fight to protect the pack and the home he had spent his entire life defending. A guard near the gate spotted her first, his eyes widening with alarm. "Luna, you should not be here," he called urgently, moving to intercept her before she could get any closer to the fighting. "I need to find Cale," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the fear pounding through her chest. Before the guard could respond, a commotion near the gate's edge drew everyone's attention. Callum had broken free from the main line of fighting, his eyes locking onto Elena with cold, calculating focus, the moment he spotted her standing near the castle wall. "There she is," he called out, a triumphant edge creeping into his voice. "The prize we came for." Elena's blood ran cold as Callum began moving toward her, and she realized with sudden clarity that Dusk Hollow's true target had never simply been Frostmore's territory. It had been her, the perceived weakness in Cale's defenses, the vulnerability they believed they could exploit to break the Alpha King's resolve entirely. Cale's head snapped toward the sound of Callum's voice, his expression shifting instantly from focused determination to raw, protective fury. He moved with a speed Elena had never witnessed before, closing the distance between himself and Callum in seconds, placing himself firmly between the Dusk Hollow warrior and the woman he had sworn to protect. "You will not touch her," Cale said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that silenced even the surrounding chaos of battle for a brief, tense moment. Callum smiled coldly, unbothered by the fury radiating from Frostmore's alpha. "Your beast has made you soft, Ashgrove," he said. "A king who cannot bear to lose his mate is a king who can be controlled. Then it is fortunate for Frostmore that losing her is not an outcome I intend to accept," Cale replied, his voice low and absolutely certain. The confrontation that followed happened quickly, Cale's controlled strength overwhelming Callum's aggressive advances within moments, his focus sharp and unwavering, despite the danger surrounding them both. Elena watched, heart in her throat, as Cale successfully drove Callum back toward the gate, the Dusk Hollow warrior finally recognizing that he had severely underestimated exactly how far Frostmore's alpha was willing to go to protect what mattered most to him. As Callum stumbled backward, a sudden horn sounded from beyond the tree line, 3 sharp blasts that seemed to carry a very different meaning than the ones that had signaled the attack's beginning hours earlier. Confusion rippled through the fighting on both sides, as the Dusk Hollow forces began pulling back, their retreat swift and disciplined despite the chaos of moments before. "Their alpha is calling them back," one of Cale's guards called out, watching the retreat with cautious relief. "They're withdrawing." Callum's expression twisted with frustration as he too was forced to retreat, casting one final, furious glance toward Cale and Elena before disappearing into the tree line alongside his remaining warriors. The sounds of battle gradually faded into an eerie, exhausted quiet, broken only by the labored breathing of Frostmore's guards and the distant sound of birds, finally daring to sing again in the evening sky. Cale turned immediately to Elena, closing the distance between them in quick, urgent strides, his hands cupping her face gently as he searched for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with lingering adrenaline and fear. "I'm fine," Elena assured him, though her own hands trembled as she gripped his forearms tightly. "You were incredible, Cale. I've never seen anything like that." You should not have come out here, Kale said, though the fierce worry in his voice carried far more affection than genuine anger. You could have been taken, or worse. I told you I wasn't going to sit somewhere safe while you faced this alone, Elena replied firmly. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Despite the exhaustion and lingering fear still evident in his expression, a small, genuine smile finally broke through Kale's composure, something warm and relieved settling over his features as he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as though reassuring himself she was truly safe and unharmed. Duskhollow underestimated us, he murmured against her hair. They believed a claimed bond would weaken Frostmore's defenses. Instead, it gave every single guard fighting today an even greater reason to hold this ground. Over the following days, reports confirmed that Duskhollow's Alpha had called off the assault upon realizing the true cost of continuing to press against Frostmore's unexpectedly fierce and unified defense. A tense but stable truce was eventually negotiated between the two packs, brokered carefully by neighboring allies who had no interest in seeing the conflict escalate further. It was not lasting peace, not entirely, but it was enough to allow Frostmore the space to heal and rebuild in the aftermath of the attack. 2 weeks later, the Great Hall was once again transformed with silver and white draping, candles lining the path toward the same platform where the ceremony had been so violently interrupted. This time, guards stood watchful but calm along the walls, and the atmosphere carried a quiet, hopeful determination rather than the anxious tension of before. Elena stood once more before Kale, dressed in the same silver gown, her hands steady this time, as Elder Nora recited the traditional words that would formally bind them together as Alpha and Luna of Frostmore. When the moment finally came for Kale to complete the claiming, he took both of Elena's hands gently in his own, his eyes holding hers with a warmth and certainty that had been hard-won through everything they had faced together. From the very first night you offered me your hand, Kale said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, you gave me something I did not know I still had the capacity to receive. Trust, peace, a reason to believe that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but partners. I claim you, Elena, not because fate demanded it, but because every single day since that night, I have chosen you freely, and I will continue choosing you for as long as I live. Elena felt tears of genuine joy gathering in her eyes as she squeezed his hands tightly. You once told me that ruling alone made you strong, she said softly. I hope by now you understand that this, standing here with you, surrounded by a pack that has fought and bled to protect what we've built together, is the greatest strength either of us could ever hope to find. The hall erupted into celebration as the ceremony concluded, pack members cheering and embracing one another, the relief and joy of survival mixing freely with the happiness of witnessing their Alpha finally find the partnership so many had believed he would never allow himself to accept. Ivy caught Elena in a fierce hug the moment the formal proceedings ended, tears streaming freely down both their faces. I told you he cared more than he knew what to do with, Ivy said, laughing through her tears. Looks like he finally figured it out. Later that evening, as the celebration continued below in the Great Hall, Kale led Elena quietly out to the same clearing in the forest where they had first spoken so honestly about the bond forming between them weeks earlier. The waterfall spilled gently over the moss-covered rocks, the sound peaceful and constant beneath the darkening evening sky. This still feels like the one place the weight of everything else disappears, Kale said softly, echoing the words he had shared about his mother so many weeks before. Then I'm glad you brought me here again, Elena said, leaning gently against his shoulder as they watched the water catch the last light of the setting sun. Kale wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, the quiet peace between them a stark and welcome contrast to everything they had endured together, to finally arrive at this moment. He thought about the night she had first crossed onto Frostmore land, terrified and alone, and how his beast, violent and unyielding toward every single soul who had come before her, had simply knelt the instant she reached out her trembling hand. He understood now, standing beside her in the quiet forest clearing, exactly why that moment had happened, and exactly what it had truly meant. Not weakness, not vulnerability to be feared and guarded against, but the beginning of something neither fate nor duty could have ever forced into existence on its own, a partnership built freely, choice by choice, day by day, between two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly where they were always meant to belong. And as the last light faded gently behind the trees, the Alpha King of Frostmoor finally understood that the strength he had spent his whole life building alone was nothing compared to the strength he had found the moment he stopped standing alone entirely.